All right, welcome back. You should be seeing Phil here, and his discussion this afternoon was entitled "How to Reach People Who Don't Already Agree with You." That sounds like a pretty useful thing, Phil. So go ahead
Yeah,
and lead on. Thanks.
thank you, Don, and thank you for anyone who's joining for this discussion. The way this software works, I actually have no idea who's here or how many people are here, and there's no way for me to see you. Hopefully, you can see me on your screen. I am monitoring the questions that you all can type. So is Dawn. I want to try to make this as interactive as possible, and the main limit on possible here is the technology. So hopefully I'll be able to monitor questions as they come in. Even though your screen tabs them as questions, I also want to invite commentary and thoughts, and it's open-ended starting now. So if people have thoughts, but I will give a few minutes of background on the session. So Don summarized it quite well a few minutes ago and just gave the title that you probably saw on your programs and emails, how to persuade people who don't already agree with you. I don't have the answer, so I hope it wasn't false advertising. I didn't come to this prepared with a prepackaged answer. I have some thoughts, but I would actually really love if we could get some collective wisdom going and see what other people think. My initial thoughts are in some ways pessimistic, in other ways optimistic. I basically think you really can't change someone's mind, that it's totally up to them to change it. And the forces that lead someone to change their own mind are complicated, and of course, they vary widely from person to person. I'll refer back to a poll Brenda did at the beginning of today's session when she asked about how many folks who were attending this conference learned about, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but I'll just say learned about, injustices uh, because of their experience with sex offense registration laws or their personal experience. And about 50% said it was their personal experience that really opened their eyes. So for many, it's a personal experience or an experience of a friend or loved one that really changes someone's mind. For many, it's rational, fact-based analysis that changes someone. For others, it's emotional. I would say for almost everyone, emotions are going to play a big role. So that's just something to keep in mind. People are inherently defensive, and I don't mean defensive just about their own conduct, but about their beliefs. If you challenge someone's beliefs, they're likely to sort of shield themselves. So, but you all know just as well as I do, I'm not the only one who's got life experience to bring to this. My approach on sex offense registration laws is really somewhat passive. I let people know the work that I'm doing, the issues I'm working on. If they show an interest, I'll give them information. But beyond that, I try to just let people use their own mind to explore things. Now I see some comments coming in, so I will engage with these. Real Bob 23, who paid for Michael's defense and how did he find you? That's a nice question. I'm happy to say that I've never had a paying client in my life. All of my work as a lawyer has been entirely pro bono. So I run a nonprofit where my salary is paid by generous donations from the public at large, not for a specific case, just in general. So my nonprofit, Equal Just Under Law, gets donations from people who support our work. That pays the salary of our small team. Right now, we're just a staff of 4. Now, Michael's case came to us actually through his brother. Those who were on the phone this morning may remember that it was his brother who had seen news about the law and said, hey, you might want to make sure that you're not covered by this law. They didn't think he was. Well, when he turned out he was covered, his brother started reaching out to a lot of nonprofits, starting with groups like the ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, and things of this sort. And none of those groups were able to help because they have limited resources and limited staffing. And so that's how he found us. he simply called and wrote, and we saw the case was righteous. So Julie Crawford asked a question I will answer, but don't know the answer to. What states are more difficult when you're dealing with someone who's required to register and is elderly? I just don't know. It's sometimes varies by the police department, not even the state, so the city. But that's not an answer that I have. Kirsten Darby, a lot of good questions coming in. Would love to hear people's thoughts as well. Um, Kirsten Darby is asking, are you familiar with SVP, sexually violent predator is what SVP normally stands for, civil commitment laws? I am. She adds, convincing lawmakers of the failed, expensive experiment that civil commitment is such a struggle. Everyone in those facilities has completed sentences subjected to a shadow prison environment. Such a good contribution, Kirsten Darby. Thank you for adding that. So for those who aren't familiar, civil commitment is a process that was actually upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court about 30 years ago in an infamous case called Kansas versus Hendricks. Essentially, what happens in a lot of states, it's not in every state, but many states have a rule where after you finish your prison sentence, right? So you're convicted of a crime, a judge says, 10 years or 5 years or 2 years or 20 years or whatever the sentence is, and bangs the gavel, and you get carted off to prison. You finish serving that time. In many states, you're not free to leave. In many states, after you've finished serving your court-ordered prison sentence, uh, often done by a bureaucracy within the prison itself, they consider various factors and decide whether to keep you locked up. And they call it civil commitment. It's called civil commitment because it's not a criminal punishment. It's not viewed as punishing you criminally. It's considered civil, meaning it's an administrative matter. They want to keep the public safe. Uh, from practical reality, civil commitment functions identical to criminal punishment. You're often locked in the exact same cell you had previously been locked in when you were serving your sentence. And it's truly an awful practice. It's very arbitrary and undefined. There's no real meaningful way out of civil commitment. Uh, and it's hard to reach people on this. This is one of those issues where people hear the phrase sexually violent predator, which I avoid using almost at all costs because it's such a loaded term. Sexually violent predator is a phrase that I don't think anyone on the advocacy side of things would use. It's generally a phrase used by state legislatures, and it tends to capture people who are not sexually violent and certainly not predators. It's based on a legislature's arbitrary determination of what that would mean. So they slap this label on you, sexually violent predator, and once the label is there, it can be very hard to prove that you're not shouldn't be detained beyond your prison sentence. John Sarna adds, your points about emotions are on target. Is there any effective way to counter this emotion with another emotion, such as having a registrant spouse, parents, or grandchildren, or children or child or children speak up, including lawmakers? So I think that's a good point. In my limited experience, I'm 37 years old, so I've had that much time on the planet to try to make the world better, to try to help people, to try to observe, to try to learn. And everyone has a different experience. So think about your own life experience. From what I've seen, fear is one of the strongest motivators, which I lament. I'm very sad about that. I try not to let fear be a motivator in my life. We see it in all sorts of directions. I'm not even going to list the numerous contexts where fear motivates people. But I think fear tends to motivate a lot of the sex offense registration laws. People hear a phrase like sexually violent predator, or frankly, just the phrase sex offense, and they get scared. They get scared about themselves or their loved ones. Thankfully, in our society, violent crime is actually fairly low. Obviously, any violent crime is a tragedy, but it's relatively low compared to what it's been in decades past. It's a relatively safe society. There still is violent crime. We'll probably never eliminate it. So how do we combat this emotion of fear? And This is going to sound a bit idealistic, but usually the counter argument is something like love or compassion. I think that's the antidote to fear. You try to unlock that empathetic part of people, and I like the point about relatives. Everyone wants to villainize someone who's been convicted of a sex offense. I don't, but a lot of people want to do that. But what about their relatives? What about their spouse? Like I told you, Michael was married, but his wife isn't able to live with her husband, right? So that there's that. There's Michael's mom who needed him to take care of him. In a lot of cases, there's children. So everyone is affected by these laws, and that can be effective. But we do need to reach legislators on a more human level to unlock that emotion of love, which again I think of as kind of the antidote to. Do you think that race is an issue in this case not being ruled on, Roger Kincaid? So I mentioned earlier this morning that we've had Michael's case going for over 6 years now, and over 4 years of no activity, just waiting for a ruling, which is itself absurd. It's hard to tell. You know, frankly, when you're dealing in criminal justice, almost all of my clients are African American. So, some of our cases get moved quickly and some more slowly. I haven't really noticed a pattern. I think it's in the deepest way. Uh, a general othering that judges tend to be drawn from the most privileged sections of society. They go to elite schools, prep schools even. They tend to be wealthy. They tend to be well connected politically. They have almost no experience with regular people. And I don't just mean people who've been convicted of crimes. I mean of all walks of life. And so when they deal with someone like Michael who has a felony conviction, that's totally foreign to them, and so they tend to deprioritize ruling on the case, which is very frustrating for us. But I don't know. I mean, we have cases, where again, almost all of my clients are African American that move quickly, and we have cases that move slowly, so it's hard to notice a pattern. Okay, so Robert Gass asks if you're related to a former judge and his response to being on a register is because the high recidivism rate. What approach can one make to begin changing his mind? Such a good question. How do we change people's minds on the high recidivism rate? I think that is a perfect opportunity just to use facts, to stay in the rational world, because it's been offered. And judges, in particular, judges and lawyers, feel an obligation to rationality. Most people, in my experience, feel no obligation to rationality. If you point out an inconsistency in their views or a contradiction, in my experience, they tend to be pretty unconcerned. They're not being graded. No one's, enforced. There are no consequences. They tend to say, well, they shrug their shoulders and are happy with inconsistent beliefs. Judges, though, typically feel an obligation to rationality. And this judge, the one that Robert mentions, cites a fact, a supposedly high recidivism rate. That happens to me all the time when I talk to people about cases I'm working on. I just respond. I usually thank them. I say I appreciate the fact-based approach. The facts that I've seen show actually a very low recidivism rate. If you're interested, here are a couple resources, and then I might link to some of the scholarly articles. But it's very passive. I don't try to force information on people. I don't try to force an opinion on them. I really strongly believe that if their mind's going to change, they need to come to it themselves. And if they don't want to, there's other people who are more open-minded that I tend to spend my time with. James Bennett writes, I have spoken with an attorney in North Carolina about petitioning the court to be removed from the registry after 10 years. The attorney stated that there was no need to attempt that until 15 years, even though North Carolina will allow removal after 10 years. He cited the federal statute that moves it out to 15 years. I do not know of that. I have not worked in North Carolina, and both sound ridiculous to me. 10 years is an arbitrary long amount of time to be on the registry, and 15 years is even longer. So I'm sorry that North Carolina is doing that, and I'm sorry that it's not automatic. Originally when these registries were designed, there was an automatic release from the registry after just a few years, 3 years or 5 years, depending on the severity of the conviction. But to hear like 10 and 15 being thrown out strikes me as uh, Alden Landers comments, it has been my experience it is an issue of mind over matter. If the situation doesn't matter to them, they don't mind. If they mind, it doesn't matter what your argument is. But being willing to listen to their side non-judgmentally is a good place to start. I think that's helpful, Alden. Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what I'm saying is, they say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. And that may be true with horses. With people, I'm not even really sure you can lead them to water, let alone forcing them to drink. They sort of have their minds of their own, as they should. I'm glad we don't live in a society full of, mindless robots and zombies. So on the whole, it's good that people have their own minds. But that means, as Owen points out, that they get to decide what they care about, and they get to ignore what they don't care about. And often, what they don't care about includes hundreds of thousands of other people who are affected by unjust laws. But yeah, I agree, Alan, that trying to listen, trying to be non-judgmental, trying to see. I always try to see where people are coming from. What is their perspective? Asking questions. If they have a dog in the fight, asking them why. I've stepped on, as I'm sure everyone has, a few landmines accidentally in talking with someone who I didn't know had a personal experience that I was unaware of. And you don't want to brush up against people's personal experiences unknowingly. It doesn't mean you can't talk about them at all. But Stephen Peterson comments, the legal profession makes a lot of money from sex offenses. Is it possible for reform while there is such a financial incentive for the industry to prosecute and defend these laws? That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, as a nonprofit attorney, I've been lucky to be sheltered from the financial impacts of the legal system. I think yes, it's hard when there is, when there are cottage industries that arise. It is hard to reform laws, but they shift. I'll give you an example here. A lot of the work we do at Equal Justice Under Law has to do with ending the use of money bail pretrial, so that people who are accused of crimes but not convicted don't have to stay in jail, or at least they don't stay in jail just because they can't afford money bail. Money bail we think of as kind of a price tag on freedom. So pretrial, the wealthy can buy their way out. People who can't stay in jail. There's a huge industry around money bail, but actually Equal Justice Under Law has ended it in several states and several cities, including San Francisco, the biggest one we've worked in, where there's no more money bail being used at all. Now, there are a lot of bail bond industries who are profiting off the money bail system. They've shifted. They've gone into GPS tracking devices, electronic monitoring, private probation, other bad things, in my opinion, other abusive criminal justice things. But they moved when we got the law declared unconstitutional. I think that something similar can happen with sex offense registration laws, that if we're able to reform those laws, those forces that stand to profit off of their existence will move to another area and profit off of some other aspect of the criminal justice system. Jeannie Mesker writes that the ACLU in her state seems aware of registry issues but unwilling to take registry cases. What do they need in order to come on board? Well, excuse me, we saw this in Alabama. Some of you who might have seen the presentation earlier today, I commented that Michael reached out to a lot of nonprofits, ACLU, Southern Private Law Center, and things like that, who just couldn't take it on. Sometimes it's a resource issue. Sometimes it's a political issue. Sex offense registration laws, unfortunately, in my mind, are I'm not sure how to say this, but there's a lot of civil rights groups that are sort of reluctant to take a strong stance on it. I don't know why that is. It could be a lack of courage. It could be, fear. These laws are so bad that it's not hard for me, but I think other groups struggle with it. And I don't know. The ACLU is not the only nonprofit, but it's one of probably the biggest civil rights nonprofits. So I think sometimes the ACLU is an ally in these issues, and sometimes they're in the camp that's in the topic of this workshop. How do you convince people who don't agree with you? It's hard. The ACLU, like a lot of nonprofits, a lot of big ones, is really driven by funding. They have huge funders, millions of dollars a year coming in at a national level to the ACLU. So I would guess their funders are calling a lot of their shots in terms of what issues that organization works on. Thomas Henderson, what legal remedies are available to a non-responsive federal appeals court? I've sadly looked into this issue. Basically none, and that is so frustrating. A trial court is a little easier. If there's a trial judge who's not doing his or her job, you can go to the appeals court to file a writ of mandamus on that trial judge. It is much harder to bring an appeals court in line because the only sort of entity above the federal appeals court is the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court is very busy. They hear less than 2% of all cases that go before it. The odds of the Supreme Court will take your case are, again, less than 2%. So it's virtually impossible to bring a federal appeals court into line. And that's just the way the system works. I mean, power does everything it can to perpetuate itself, and we see that happening in the justice system. Is they're not going to relinquish it easily. I love all these comments. I'm going to keep going through them because I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible. Although the medium prevents a real back and forth. Michael Shimkin writes, how do you influence the uninformed who say that recidivism is low because the registry is working? So what I would say on that point, such a good question. The registry varies state to state. Not every state, actually, it's more than half states don't have residency restrictions. There may be counties in those states, but residency restrictions, for example, are not in every state. Employment restrictions, travel restrictions, the amount of time you have to report, whether the registry is itself public or private. Registry started out as private. In other words, only law enforcement can access the registry. In most states now, they're public. Any person can go on, to Megan's Law, whatever, and find out where people live. So there's two things I would say in response. One is when someone says the registry is working, there isn't really evidence given that so many different registries in different states operate differently, and yet the recidivism rate is low across the board nationwide in every state. Sex offenses just have a low recidivism rate regardless of the registry, so there's no causal connection. The other thing I say in response to that is logic. There are experts in these fields. And I don't mean people like me. I actually mean trained academics, people who spent 7, 8, 9 years researching, getting PhDs in criminology and sociology, people who really have studied and researched patterns of criminology. And there's a lot of work out there, but one common thread through all the research is that factors that increase violent crime include unstable housing, unstable employment, and the lack of pro-social relationships. So as a criminologist, the experts, the academics would say you should never destabilize housing, you should never destabilize employment, you should never destabilize pro-social relationships. The registry laws make all of those things unstable. I talked about Michael this morning. It's hard for him to find a house, basically impossible. It's hard for him to find jobs, basically impossible. He's been taken away from his mom, his brother, his wife. The relationships in his life are being hampered. Those are factors that a trained criminologist would say that's only going to increase the risk of crime, not decrease it. So, and they're kind of intuitive. You wouldn't want to take away those resources from someone if you're working to lower crime rates. So, Michael, it's a great question. That's how I would respond. Laurie Kepros, implementation research discusses how people need to hear something 7 times before they internalize it. It's important to take every opportunity to do the educational process. There are a lot of punitive laws being introduced all the time. Not only are these laws we should oppose, but even if they're going to pass, do not miss an opportunity to coordinate an educational response. Be educational for the media too, who love extreme sex offense bills for salacious coverage. So true, and I like that you've added that, Laurie, because I'm not sure if you meant it as pushback, but I count it as helpful and welcome pushback on what I described as a passive attitude. I think Laurie is exactly right. I try not to get preachy on people who disagree with me. I try not to get invested in changing their mind. If they're not going to change their mind, that's fine. But whenever, particularly this topic of sense effect registration laws come up, I don't sit silent. I'll always add something like, more than 95% of people convicted of sex offenses never commit another crime again. I'll just cite a statistic because I think Laurie's exactly right. Education is key, and people need to hear this, or at least hear someone state it, and then think maybe I'll look into that later. Julian Hutchinson, it seems the general public is at a disadvantage when dealing with a sex offender because once the label's in place, the details of the crime are essentially lost. How can we change the way sex offenders are defined? I can think of other fields such as medicine where only the well-trained would determine a diagnosis / label. So Julian, I appreciate the comment. I will say on this that I think it's important to avoid the label altogether. I actually don't use the term sex offender because I think, first of all, it labels people just exactly as you say, and that can be damaging. Um, I prefer person first language. But second of all, because the term has no meaning. As I mentioned in Alabama, the label that used to go on driver's license, that law, by the way, has since been reformed. But the notion of a criminal sex offender, that could include someone who's committed only a misdemeanor as opposed to felony. It could include a one-time offender. It can include someone whose only offense was decades and decades ago. It includes someone who offended against an adult versus a child. It's not a homogenous concept, and I think it's really misleading for people to use the phrase sex offender. And as Julian, as you correctly point out, it can be really damaging. So I never use that label. I might say a person convicted of a sex offense. And I would start by trying to encourage folks that you're dealing with to not think in terms of labels, but to think in terms of what we call person first language. Remember, this is a complete person who's lived a whole complete life, like Michael. He's not just someone who's convicted of a sex offense. He's also someone who, is a musician, someone who's a hairstylist, someone who's married, someone who has, who had an aging mom that he wanted to take care of. There's many different features to his life. Kathy Payton wants to know, does a person have a right to their own unbiased psychological evaluation prior to a court case for SVP determination, sexually violent predator? Yes, I guess. It depends what you mean by unbiased. The difficulty is in our justice system that state psychologists are considered unbiased because they're not part of the defense or the prosecution. People who take those jobs tend to have significant biases. They tend to be very interested in public safety. They tend to be less concerned about the rights of individuals. So there is a psychological evaluation. I don't know in my experience that I would call it unbiased, but the state views it as unbiased. Gloria Click has a question about Michael. Does Michael's brother feel guilt or kick himself from time to time for telling his brother info that caused so many problems? What's the best way to treat ourselves when our words or actions cause similar problems for a family member? This is a real tough one because I'm friends with Michael and his brother. I've gotten to know them both. Absolutely, yes. His brother feels tremendous guilt, even though Michael would say he shouldn't. And it's painful. It's totally good intentions. I think everyone assumed, this is before I met them, everyone assumed that Michael would not come under the purview of this law. And I think you're right. It's how do we treat ourselves when we've caused problems. I'm a big fan of forgiveness. I do this sort of thing all the time with my loved ones on accident, say things that hurt them or do things that hurt them, never on purpose. I try to open up with them and tell them what my motivation was, which is always good intentions, and that I'm feeling sorry that it happened, and basically in an implicit way asking for their forgiveness. But really, it's about we have to forgive ourselves. Um, Aging on the registry. So post Lauren's comments, aging on the registry. How does one comply with the process if he's in a nursing home and it's out of his mind, has no idea what is going on? Yeah, it's very hard. Someone in that position hopefully has like a power of attorney situation where someone can do it, but often there's no way to. Um, Tina Fillinger, given that most victims of sexual crimes are women, do women need to take a lead in the movement to reform the conversation? I think that's a great contribution, Tina. Um, I think so. I think victims can and more do play a role in reforming these unjust sex offense laws. I mean, my goal is a rational set of laws that actually promotes whatever the valid state interests are. If the state is interested in public safety, great. So am I. So are victims. So is everyone else. But do laws that make it hard for someone to find any place to live promote public safety? I think probably not. I think the research shows probably not. Um, do laws that make it harder for people to work, help public safety? I think probably not. So I think victims who study the issue hopefully will find some of those rational, the research-based evidence, and try to help lead the reform. It's hard to get victims to do that, of course. I mean, every person varies wildly in how they respond to being a victim of a crime. Um, for some people, it's a terrible moment in their life that they never want to think about again. That person is probably not going to help lead a movement to reform sex offense laws. For other people, it becomes their life passion, and hopefully those people will pursue their passion based on evidence and fact. But I agree with Tina. I like that point, that victims have just as much interest as everyone else. We all have the same interest in improving laws so that it can make society better. Um, uh, let's see. Laurie Capros again chimes in. You have to teach legislatures the vocabulary to defend their righteous positions to an uninformed public. I think that's a valid point. Jeffrey Russell, is it possible to lodge a complaint against a judge or attorney for gross malpractice if they stubbornly refuse to accept the fact, like their recidivism, even though the matter has been thoroughly and unequivocally vetted by scientific evidence? Can we, in effect, sue a judge for wrongfully or willfully ignoring the truth? No, you can't sue a judge for willfully ignoring the truth. Unfortunately, and in my experience as a lawyer, that would be a lot of judges who would be vulnerable. So I said earlier that power does everything it can to perpetuate itself, and one of the ways is by creating this doctrine of judicial immunity. Basically, no matter how bad a judge is, as long as they're not, walking out of the courtroom and shooting people or whatever, if they're just doing their job, even if they're doing it really badly, they can't be sued for it. They, and there's a lot of judges. There's a lot of great judges out there, I will say. But there's also a lot of bad judges. There's a lot of judges who do not look at the facts at all. I've been very lucky in my legal career to go before judges who very consistently do look at the facts. They're open-minded. Some of that burden's on the lawyer. A lawyer can do a lot of things to close the mind of a judge. And so lawyers do need to be careful in the courtroom to monitor their own actions to get that judge to stay open-minded. But judges, in my opinion, should stay open-minded. Cindy Prizio, victims advocates in my state are misguided at best. Use bad data, totally opposite of yours, and our citations. They are bringing harm to all people on both sides. Yeah, I've seen that. It's hard for me to figure out what to do about it. We're definitely in a culture right now where whoever kind of yells the loudest is presumed to get the best word. To some extent, I'm happy about that when it's on my side. I think right now with the killing of George Floyd, we're seeing a lot of yelling, and a lot of yelling that I agree with, and a lot of people in the streets looking for the end to police brutality and some meaningful criminal justice reform. I agree with all those outcomes. I think the methods are marching and protesting and holding signs, signs that I agree with, but often that have very little actual content, very little factual content. They're really conveying emotions. So when I agree with it, I guess I'm happy. When I disagree with it, it's frustrating. And I've seen the same thing Cindy's pointing out, that the opposition often uses what they call data, that's the opposite of what we would cite to. On sex offense registration, I've looked at it really closely in the courtroom. I actually don't think there is data on the other side. When we sued Alabama, they didn't have an expert that could say that recidivism rates were high. They didn't have an expert that could show data showing that, for example, someone like Michael, who has never committed any crime against a child, could possibly be a risk around school. So I'm not 100% sure the data is even actually out there. I know that people cite to data, but it's often what does the president call it? Fake news or whatever. I'm not sure that the actual academic work. I think it's pretty much in unison, particularly on issues like recidivism rates of people who've been convicted of sex offenses. There's not a big controversy in the academic world. Um, okay, Craig McAlexander. Uh, he notes maybe you can't make the horse drink water, but you can salt their oats, and I like that clever point. There are motivations out there beyond persuasion that can get people to listen. Heidi Moore, this is helpful. She gives a comment. She starts by telling the person that she is a victim and an advocate for rational sex offense laws. She tells specific stories. People are usually surprised because they didn't know that certain acts could get someone on the registry. And I think that's really helpful. What Heidi's doing is a combination of facts with her experience, but also emotions. And I think that's really the best combination. That's what I try to do when I talk about my work. I certainly talk about the law and why it's irrational, but I also try to talk about clients or friends or people I've known who have been abused by these laws, to make it more meaningful, which operates on an emotional level. Everybody has a heart. Everybody cares in some way. So there are ways to reach people. So this is the last comment because I'm being conscious of time, and then I want to wrap up with some final thoughts. I've noticed that many anti-registry advocates approach the issues from the political left. In my view, the harm wrought by the registry is nonpartisan, and registrants come from all political stripes. In addition, some criminal justice reform initiatives are supported by the right, as in Georgia. Do we limit our effectiveness by assuming that everyone in the anti-registry movement shares the same political commitments? I love that point. It's actually something it was kind of related to what I will end on. I completely agree. So I'm an independent in terms of politics. I don't find myself aligning with Democrats or Republicans at all. I think in terms of my work, this comment is exactly on point. People would assume that I'm coming from the political left. That assumption might be harmful, and I don't think there's any reason for it. I think staying open-minded, avoiding labels. There are a lot of good reasons to oppose sex offense registration laws. One of them might be because you actually care strongly about public safety. That's more of a conservative ideal. Another reason you might oppose sex offense registration laws is because you care a lot about individual rights, which is more of a liberal ideal. But it sort of doesn't matter. The laws are so bad in so many ways. They're harming so many people who are required to register, of course, but probably increasing crime rates by destabilizing housing, by destabilizing employment. So I walk into every courtroom and assume that the judge and jury, regardless of where they come from politically, has a path towards seeing that this situation needs improvement, and to avoid euphemisms, will say that the registry laws should be repealed. We really don't need them. They've never helped. They came in response to over dramatization of a real tragedy. Not to minimize the victims of any sexual offenses. Those are serious tragedies, but when you legislate around individual tragedies, you tend to get really bad laws, and that's what we've seen across the board. So I will close with that and assume that everyone can be an ally if they want to. I would try to think of the antidote to fear as love, showing compassion for others, showing compassion for yourself, showing compassion for your adversary. It's not a guaranteed solution, of course. We know that there is no silver bullet. There's no way to automatically win every argument. If there was, we'd all be doing it. But we try our best. And I want to thank you all both for being part of this workshop and this conference, but for being thoughtful. for trying to figure out ways to advance the ball, to make society more rational, to make our laws more rational. And finally, to Dawn and Brenda and the whole team, this virtual conference is very difficult. I would never be able to pull it off. And despite a small number of tentative glitches, I think from my side of things, it's gone amazingly. So thank you, Dawn, and thank you for hosting this workshop.
Bill, I appreciate it, but just a time check. The time window allowed for Q&A, and you have been doing Q&A all through your presentation. So
Yeah.
we actually have another 15 minutes if you want to keep going and answer some more of these questions.
Oh yeah, let me do a few more.
Our
I'll just do
Q&A
a couple.
runs till 2:30, so if you want to keep going, you can.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I'll do a couple more, Dom, but I had it on my calendar till 2:20 and then scheduled another event, so I'll apologize to the folks.
Okay.
Um, but I do have do want to do a couple more. Let's see, folks who haven't commented yet. Stephen Williams, there's a law that felons can't congregate with other felons. I know this is intended to keep felons from planning a bank robbery together, not to provide encouragement in Bible study. Stephen, it's a good contribution. Yes, at least on the federal level. Generally, the terms of supervised release after you've been released from prison prevent you from associating with a known felon. Now, I also try to avoid the word felon, which is also a label. But if you've previously been convicted of a felony, you're supposed to avoid associating with someone that you know to have previously been convicted of a felony. But it's not illegal if you don't know it. So, it's a complicated set of laws, and the intent certainly is to prevent people from planning bank robberies. But I'll say the people who wrote those laws think that studying the Bible amongst a group of people with prior felony convictions could lead to bank robberies. Oops, I messed things up. Lynn asks, what parts of your case did the original judge agree with to strike down, and what parts did he leave intact? So the judge in our case struck down portions of the travel restriction, the registration rules, and the dual registration requirements. So he tried to lighten the burden on people in terms of checking in with both the police department and the sheriff, getting advance permission before travel, registering up to 112 times a year. He left completely intact the residency restrictions, which in my opinion were the most onerous, and the employment restrictions. So it's still the case in Alabama that you can't live in a home that's within 2,000 feet of a school or daycare. All right, King Alexander is the chair of amicus committee for the Louisiana Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers for the federal law court at the district court level. He says, I relate to Phil's client because he's also 65 and before law school was a professional. And he remembers when I spoke in Atlanta, I was in disbelief about Alabama's registration laws. Louisiana's are also bad. His question was what he calls start over provisions, requiring starting the entire registration period over if any person is serving a felony conviction of any kind. Louisiana does not give credit for time spent on the registry, so the time spent on the registry starts over for any crime. Again, and he says he's at a loss concerning the legitimate governmental interests. I can't. Effectively, what Louisiana does in a number of areas, and we've done some work in Louisiana as well, is just try to pile on punishment. And so I think I'll use this to truly close. When there's a punitive motive, the legitimacy of interest often goes by the wayside. And Louisiana just tries to pile on punishment, which is puzzling because the judge already punishes people with a prison sentence. And then the legislature tries to add on punishment in many ways. This is just one of them. One of the ways they're adding to a punishment of a crime is saying, oh, yeah, and your registration period starts over. I don't think those provisions have been challenged. I think they're ripe for a challenge because they lack any rational basis. And in our country, laws are supposed to have some rational basis. But it's hard. So, that punitive instinct is sort of that fear-based mindset, a theme I've tried to weave throughout some of these comments. And that's really what we have to address. And I start by addressing it in myself. I'm afraid of heights. I'm afraid of spiders. I'm afraid of all sorts of things. And I try not to let those fears motivate me. So when a spider comes in my house, I do my best to get a cup and a piece of paper and let it outside, as scary as it is. My family has various fears, and we try to talk amongst ourselves about how to overcome them rather than let them guide our lives. And legislators have fears, and citizens have fears. And it's about dealing with fear in a way that doesn't cause harm to others that we need to master. Because too often, as a citizenry and our legislatures lash out when they're afraid of something, they think of piling on punishment, and I think there's often a better solution. Again, thank you all for participating. Don, thank you so much for hosting the room. I wish I could see folks, but I'll look forward, hopefully at the next, whenever there is more live in-person conferences of this sort, look forward to meeting many of you in person.
Phil, thank you very much. We appreciate your participation today, and we certainly appreciate all that you are doing on the legal front to defend the cause and across the board to defend these social justice causes. So thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Don. We're all on the same team. We'll keep fighting.